So the Fable 5 Mythos 5 ban is over, but the story isn't. So today, July 1st, Anthropic begins restoring global access to Claude Fable 5 and Mythos 5. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick sent a letter to Anthropic co-founder Tom Brown confirming the export controls are lifted. An interesting thing to note here, of course, is that the communications have shifted from being with Dario Amodei to Tom Brown, kind of speaking to the political undertones that are there related to the relationship between the two entities, I should say, the U.S. federal government, of course, the current administration, and Dario Amodei at Anthropic. I want to give a quick recap of what happened for folks that haven't been following the story to begin with. So Fable 5 and Mythos 5 launched June 9th as the most capable AI model publicly ever released. And then within days, the Trump administration ordered Anthropic to restrict access to all foreign nationals, including the company's own employees. And Anthropic took both models completely offline to comply with the request. The trigger was reportedly tied to Amazon flagging a jailbreak that could bypass Fable 5's safety guardrails, which escalated into a national security review. The government never provided a specific public reason beyond, quote, unspecified national security concerns, though officials were reportedly focused on the model's autonomous cyber capabilities. Things like zero-day discovery, multi-stage attack simulation. The UK AISI, for example, confirmed Mythos completed a 32-step corporate network attack in their simulated environment, something I've touched on in a piece I called the attack the attack surface exponential, as the piece I talked about, and the cyber capability curve. So UK's AISI has had some great research there. They actually showed GPT 5.5 had similar capabilities once it came out as well. So what are the conditions for lifting? Anthropic agreed to proactively detect and address security risks, work with government on safety standards for future models, and report any malicious activity it detects. This is a phased restoration, not necessarily an instant flip. So why does this matter beyond the headline? This wasn't just a product availability issue. What happened over the past 3 weeks reshaped conversations about AI governance, technology sovereignty, and the relationship between cyber capabilities and AI regulations in ways that aren't going to just go away because the ban is lifted. So I wrote a piece previously titled Cybersecurity's Friendly Fire Problem. I wrote about the dynamic in real time, arguing that the ban was strategically counterproductive for various reasons. So there's, cyber's having this unique role in AI regulation. If we step back and look at the bigger picture, cybersecurity has become the primary lens through which governments are evaluating and regulating AI. Not bias, not labor displacement, not misinformation, but cybersecurity. So the AI executive order that dropped on June 2nd established the framework that made this ban possible. It introduced a voluntary pre-release review of frontier models, a 30-day early access window for NSA and CISA. NSA-led classified benchmarking to define what quote-unquote covered frontier models are, and a new AI cybersecurity clearinghouse, which would be run by Treasury, NSA, and CISA. It's worth knowing that none of those processes, as far as I know, have been fully established. I don't know if they fully define necessarily what a covered frontier model is or the criteria to classify a model as a covered frontier model, but nonetheless, the regulatory band, the voluntary, kind of gated release has already been taking place. So the EO was explicitly voluntary for industry. It even included safeguard language saying nothing creates mandatory licensing or pre-clearance. But within a week of Fable launching, the government used export control authority to do what the EO said it wouldn't, effectively mandating a pre-release, pre-clearance process for one company's models. The gap between the voluntary framework and the actual enforcement action is the story here. The regulation pendulum piece I wrote about tracked this down, how the administration went from aggressive deregulation to actively studying pre-deployment safety testing in under a year. The Fable ban was the pendulum swinging further than even the EO contemplated. The clearinghouse concept is interesting in theory too. I covered this in a piece I titled "The Vulnapocalypse Won't Wait for Interagency Coordination." It arrives against the backdrop of the NVD collapsing, the OIG audit that found that severity scores, accuracy from NVD was only accurate 12% of the time, the NVD having a 27,000 backlog CVE, and NIST abandoning universal enrichment that the industry has kind of been navigating since that happened. Essentially, NIST kind of announcing that they will only enrich a subset of CVEs overall. So leaving it up to industry to kind of navigating that. And there's now been conversations of other international, governments providing vulnerability databases, for example, which has been an ongoing effort, but also commercial providers trying to step in and cover that gap as well. So the government's building this new coordination, infrastructure and kind of workflow while the existing coordination infrastructure is failing, which is really interesting as well. There's also the international fallout, AI sovereignty going mainstream, for example. The industry and international reaction was immediate, and I saw this all over my LinkedIn as I watched the conversations take place. And I think this is actually more consequential than the ban itself. So the ban applied to all foreign nationals, including Five Eyes partners such as the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, The UK's AI Security Institute was reportedly affected. These are our closest allies, our closest intelligence sharing allies, and they were cut off without warning. And this has, come up in conversations and quotes from those leaders. For example, the Canadian PM Mark Carney said the situation showed what happens when, quote, over-reliance on a single nation's AI infrastructure takes place. France's Bruno, I'm not even going to try to pronounce his last name, but call it a wake-up call that, quote, a nation that depends on others for its technology is a nation that can be unplugged overnight. So all over my LinkedIn feed, there was all kinds of conversations around, tech sovereignty among EU and international partners. It was in the, podcasts I would listen to, things of that nature. I do want to caveat that, while there's a lot of conversations around tech sovereignty and so on, the EU has struggled incredibly when it comes to AI, software, cybersecurity in many ways, just due to various factors there that they, don't have the exact same market dynamics in the United States, the same amount of capital, the same regulatory constructs, things of that nature. They've also set out to be a regulatory superpower, which, honestly, in many ways can harm their economic and technological aspirations, in my opinion. It'll be interesting to see where this goes. But nonetheless, the EU, which was already moving, kind of in the direction of digital sovereignty, now has a concrete example to point to. So the conversation shifted from theoretical, kind of what if to this actually happened and happened to allies. This accelerated something that I've been concerned about as well, which is international partners building domestic AI capabilities specifically to reduce the dependence on U.S. providers. It's not necessarily inherently bad. Of course, it's in many ways in their own best interests, but it does fragment the ecosystem. It reduces interoperability. It weakens the network effects that made U.S. AI leadership valuable in the first place. And it's honestly counterintuitive. If you look at the AI executive order, and many of the executives' orders around AI and kind of direction of this administration since they came into office, the focus was on deregulation, competitive dynamics with China, making the U.S. the leader in AI. And as we implement this ban, it's kind of added more scrutiny, right, from international partners. It's kind of undermined our goals. So it's really ironic. The administration's own executive order frames American AI leadership as a core national security priority, and it directs CISA to facilitate access to frontier models for agencies, state and local authorities, and critical infrastructure operators. Then it demonstrated to the world that relying on US AI infrastructure carries political risks. That contradiction is hard to walk back, even after the ban has been lifted. I touched on this, of course, in my piece, Friendly Fire, where I talked about every restriction that the U.S. places on its own frontier capabilities creates a stronger incentive for the rest of the world to invest in alternatives that the U.S. does not control. There's also the fact that China is, many argue, already here. They've caught up in the AI race. And there's been this conversation, of course, for a long time. There's a lot in this conversation around distillation attacks. But while we were debating whether to let allies use Fable, China shipped a model called GLM 5.2. This is a 753 billion parameter mixture of experts model, and it was released on June 16th under an MIT license with documentation explicitly noting, quote, no regional limits, and, quote, technical access without borders. So it has a million token context window, beating GPT 5.5 on multiple long horizon coding benchmarks. And it costs roughly $1.40 or $4.40 per million tokens, a fraction of the frontier proprietary pricing. For example, I've been following the work of Joshua Sachs when it comes to AI and cybersecurity. He has an excellent Substack. I definitely recommend checking it out. He made the case that GLM 5.2, not Mythos, is the real security emergency. It can be downloaded, run locally on H200 GPUs, and fine-tuned to remove all safety guardrails, and operated with zero logging, zero monitoring, zero accountability to any provider. No trust and safety team, no watching, no account to ban. That's the visibility problem I keep coming back to. So Anthropic caught the first documented AI orchestrated espionage campaign in September 2025 because the attackers were using monitored infrastructure. They mapped the operation across roughly 30 global targets. They banned accounts, notified victims, and coordinated with authorities. That detection is only possible on API-gated, commercially operated models. It disappears entirely with self-hosted open-weight models. The ban didn't remove the capability from the threat landscape. GLM 5.2 was already available before Fable launched. What the ban did, though, was remove our best ability to see, how adversaries are using these frontier capabilities. And then while the open weights alternatives they were migrating offered us nothing the same. They can run on their own local infrastructure, their own environments. We lose that visibility, that governance, to kind of see their tactics, their TTPs, what they're doing on LLMs when it comes to cybersecurity activities. So it removes that visibility from us entirely. And as we've removed that visibility, even with the ban being lifted, the other models that are catching up from the open source ecosystem, which ironically are overwhelmingly, from China, our near peer competitor on AI, Those alternatives all come from our biggest kind of, I don't want to say adversary, but our biggest competitor, right, on AI. So I wrote about this again in my article, Friendly Fire, where I talked about GLM 5.2 versus Mythos and Anthropic, detecting espionage campaigns. And then there's also the news of the GPT 5.6 rollout, which took a voluntary path. This is much more in line with the executive order, right, where Anthropic's, Fable 5, Mythos 5 had the regulatory ban on export controls, and it was kind of involuntary. It definitely was a contentious relationship, kind of shook the industry in many ways. Many people point to political, friction between the two entities, the U.S. government and Anthropic. OpenAI's GPT 5.6 was a much different scenario in some ways because it was a voluntary path. This wasn't only an Anthropic story overall, though. OpenAI's GPT 5.6 also had its release delayed, but the dynamics were different and instructive. On June 25th, Sam Altman disclosed that OpenAI was postponing the broad public release of GPT 5.6 at the administration's request. And GPT 5.6 is the first model to go through the voluntary review process established by the AI executive order I've been talking about, which was it meant that a limited preview was made available to a select group of trusted enterprise partners, with the government approving customer access case by case. OpenAI described it as a short-term step, and they expected broader availability in the coming weeks. The key difference, of course, is that this was voluntary compliance with the EO's framework, not an export control mandate imposed after the fact. That distinction matters because it kind of sets the precedent here. The EO created a voluntary review process. Anthropic got an involuntary one. So whether future frontier model releases follow GPT 5.6 voluntary path or Fable's forced path will define how AI governance works in practice versus on paper. It's also worth watching whether lifting the Fable ban and GPT 5.6 voluntary process creates a template, or whether in the next model release that scares someone in the government gets export control treatment again. That uncertainty itself is a governance failure. Companies can't build release strategies around unpredictable enforcement. Then we also have the jagged frontier, this reality that you don't need frontier models to find 0 days. This is something that's been demonstrated again and again in the community. And this is the part of the conversation I think is getting lost in the Fable 5 or GPT 5.6 drama. The entire framing of frontier models are uniquely dangerous has a serious empirical problem. For example, the team at ISLE, they publish a blog titled The AI Cybersecurity After Mythos, The Jagged Frontier, and they published this a day after Anthropic's original Mythos announcement. They tested Mythos' flagship findings using small, cheap, and open-weight models, and they found 8 out of 8 models detected a free BSD exploit, including a 3.6 billion parameter model that cost 11 cents per million tokens, 600 times cheaper than Mythos. And they used a 5.1 billion active open model, recovered the core chain of 27-year-old OpenBSD bug that Anthropic highlighted as a signature finding as well. Then you also have security leaders such as Nils Provost, who I've interviewed on the Resilient Cyber Show. He has some excellent blogs on these topics. He showed in his work that the capability lives in the harness, not just in the weights. It's an orchestration and system engineering problem, not purely a model scale problem. There's some interesting aspects to this. Like more and more you keep hearing these phrases such as scaffolding and harness. I've shared some resources around what that means, what harness engineering means as well. Some have pointed out, of course, like with each new model released, kind of the new model eats the harness, to say. It kind of abstracts a lot, some of the minutia away that you don't need to necessarily make a bespoke custom harness. But nonetheless, these efforts by Niels and IO and others have shown the power of an effective harness, and you can use it to find these things. So for example, IO has since published that they discovered 20 OpenSSL 0-day findings in 6 months using this approach. Not with frontier models, but with an effective harness engineering around smaller ones. This is what I call the jagged frontier, and what they dubbed it in their blog as well. The capability distribution isn't a smooth curve where bigger always wins. Rankings reshuffle depending on the task. For example, banning one model at the top of the leaderboard doesn't remove the capability from the ecosystem. So if the policy rationale for the ban was, quote, this model can find 0 days, the honest follow-up question is, so can models that cost 600 times less and are available to anyone with an internet connection. So what exactly did restricting Fable accomplish? There's also the cost reckoning and the open source shift that I just was discussing here. There's another force accelerating the move toward open source models that have nothing to do with geopolitics, and that's cost, finances, economics. There was this phrase that took hold called quote unquote token maxing, where organizations were basically incentivized, right? From the leadership, from the top down, to kind of use as many tokens as they can, use as much AI, agentic coding tools, et cetera, as they can. That's coming to an end. For example, Uber burned through its entire 2026 AI budget in 4 months. Meta imposed centralized spending controls after internal token consumption was on track for billions in cost, and the pattern played out at other organizations as well, such as Amazon, Salesforce, and others. So agentic AI workflows consume up to 1,000 more tokens than standard model interactions. So when you combine that with the shift from flat subscriptions to usage-based pricing, enterprise AI bills become unpredictable and enormous, and that simply wasn't going to fly in the finance department, right? They started implementing these restrictions or guardrails around token maxing, as you would call it, using as many tokens as you can. Of course, it has financial implications for organizations. So the response has been a hard pivot toward cost efficiency. Fortune declared, quote unquote, token maxing is dead. CNBC reported OpenAI and Anthropic facing a new AI spending reality as enterprises shifted to efficiency. I saw this in my network with Open Router and others. These phrases such as fusion models or folks using starting to kind of have some diligence around how they use these models. For example, routing some tasks and activities to open source or smaller models that are much more cost efficient and friendly, or using frontier models where it makes sense. There was a great interview in terms of finding vulnerabilities and so on, vulnerability discovery and reporting and research on the Risky Biz podcast, where the individual discussed using frontier models to kind of orchestrate locally hosted models to find, identify, and report on vulnerabilities. So open source models went from holding roughly a third of usage in late 2025 to dominating up to 60% of token traffic by mid 2026. For example, CEO of Lindy, an AI startup, publicly moved 100% of his traffic off Anthropic's Claude and onto DeepSeek. We've heard similar conversations among Microsoft, which I thought was super interesting, given how quickly or how closely Microsoft works with the federal government, for example, to hear them considering using DeepSeek, right? Which, there was a quote unquote DeepSeek moment, which shook the market due to the cost implications of what DeepSeek originally was able to do, but also led to conversations around model distillation or, the risks associated with Chinese models, et cetera. And now you have the largest technology provider that works with the US government considering using DeepSeek, which is incredibly ironic. So Fable 5 pricing is priced at $10 to 50 or $10, $50 per million tokens, and Mythos at even higher. So when GLM 5.2 offers competitive performance at $1.40 to, it means cost alone is pushing adoption towards open weight alternatives, independent of any policy decision. And so there's vuln-apocalypse as well as part of this conversation, where there's kind of a circular economics here, right? Use the frontier models to find vulnerabilities, use the frontier models to fix vulnerabilities. And in that loop, of course, is the frontier model providers and their APIs and their consumption. They get paid at every step of that process. The open source leaderboard, of course, as I talked about, is Chinese, overwhelmingly Chinese. And here's where all the threads converge into something that should concern everyone working on US AI strategy. Chinese labs now hold 4 of the top 5 positions in open weight AI. GLM-5 from Zipu AI, Quen 3.5, you have Kimi 2.5, DeepSeek V4, of course. Meta's Llama is the only US entrant still competitive at that tier, and it's losing ground quickly. For example, Quen surpassed Llama in cumulative downloads in January 2026, exceeding 700 million. And by early 2026, Quen derivatives accounted for nearly 50% of all new language model uploads on Hugging Face, while Llama contracted to about 12%. So Alibaba alone has more derivative models, 113,000 plus, than Google and Meta combined. GLM-5 was trained entirely on Huawei Ascend chips, not NVIDIA hardware, so the chip export controls that were supposed to constrain Chinese AI development instead forced Chinese labs to innovate on software efficiency. Those efficiency gains now make their open source models cheaper and more accessible than US alternatives. So the landscape looks like this. The US government restricted access to the most capable closed source model. The voluntary review process is creating uncertainty for the next one. And enterprise cost pressures are pushing adoption toward open source. And the leading open source options are all almost entirely built by America's primary strategic competitor in the AI race, which is China. There's folks who have written about this too on Substack, some amazing articles that I've shared. Folks such as Nathan Lambert and Kevin Zhu, they argued that banning and restricting open source AI would push the world even closer towards Chinese alternatives. They didn't have to wait long for this to be proven right either. The market is already moving in that direction on its own. Policy decisions that make U.S. frontier models harder or more expensive to access just accelerate this entire trend. So what does the lift actually change? The ban is lifted, Fable is back. What actually changed? The conditions Anthropic agreed to, which are proactive security monitoring, cooperation on standards, reporting malicious activity. These are things that Anthropic was already doing. They caught the espionage campaign. They shared that publicly. They built the safety classifiers, they invested in red teaming. The conditions to formalize what was already happening is taking place now. What didn't change, though, GLM 5.2 is still available under MIT licensing, with no regional limits. The token maxing backlash is still pushing enterprises towards cheap open source alternatives. International partners are still investing in AI sovereignty. The jagged frontier still means AI offensive cyber capabilities are available well below the frontier threshold. What did change and what can't be undone is the precedent. Every AI lab now knows that the US government can and will use export control authority to pull a model off the market after launch, outside the voluntary framework established by its own executive order. Every international partner now knows that access to US AI infrastructure can be revoked without warning, including for Five Eyes allies. The organizations that try to ban their way to security end up with less security, not more. I wrote about this in my Friendly Fire piece. The lift is a step back toward rationality, but the damage to trust, the voluntary framework's credibility, and the American position as a reliable AI partner is already done. Damage has already taken place. The path forward is what I've been arguing. Govern, don't ban. Diffusion over denial. Arm the defenders. Compete. Today's announcement suggests that the administration may be learning that lesson, but whether it sticks is the question that matters. Nonetheless, I look forward to following this story. I'm sure this isn't going to be the last we hear about regulatory control, licensing, gated releases of frontier model capabilities. I'll be following all that on the channel and sharing my thoughts along the process, so definitely subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one.